Appreciate you all being here. I'm Mayor Chaz Jones, and happy Indigenous Peoples Day. I feel very honored and to welcome my friend, colleague, and our presenter, Dr. Luhui Whitebear, an assistant professor from Oregon State University. And she's going to offer her personal reflections on Indigenous Peoples Day and treat us with some stories and some other treats. So thank you so much, Luhui. Appreciate you being here. Yeah.
Colonization has taught me, but I don't listen. Colonization has taught me. Colonization has taught me that I'm an outsider on my ancestral homelands. Colonization has taught me my name is. It's okay. Colonization has taught me that sacred lands are commodity. Colonization has taught me roll numbers mean more than the teachings. Colonization has taught me that I am viewed as something to be owned. Colonization has taught me to hide, to stay silent, to not make waves. Colonization has taught me. But faith, love, and compassion have taught me. But faith, love, and compassion have taught me that my spirit was meant to soar. But faith, love, and compassion have taught me to listen to the wind and stars. But faith, love, and compassion have taught me that stories are memories and instructions. But faith, love, and compassion have taught me we belong to earth, not the other way around. But faith, love, and compassion have taught me that colonization is afraid of us more than it shows. But faith, love, and compassion have taught me we are meant to survive, to live, to renew. But faith, love, and compassion have taught me, and that is what I listen to. So Haku and Slahayam, hello, and Sumwich, and in Chinookawawa. My name is Luhui Whitebear. I'm enrolled with the Coastal Band of the Chumash Nation, which is not a federally recognized tribe, but we have our own sovereign status in the state of California. I also have Waztec and Cochimi ancestry and have lived most of my life up here in Oregon, in proximity with my stepdad's people, the Siletz tribe. So I have a lot of family over there as well. As already said, I'm an assistant professor. You said that right? Yeah. I was like, and Oregon State University for the School of Language, Culture, and Society. I mostly teach for our Indigenous Studies minor, and we just had our Indigenous Peoples Day event over there as well on campus, and so that was great. And I'm really excited to be able to be here with you all to share some words, some reflections, and I thought I'd start with start with this poem to kind of center myself in this space and for you to kind of get to know my style and everything. And I wanted to share with you a little bit about my relationship with Indigenous Peoples Day and how it's changed over the years, and as a place to start as well. And I'm going to be sharing some more poems too. So for folk who do know me, I'm kind of active in the community. I have an activist background. I was born into it. My parents met protesting a LNG line in California, so it's kind of part of who I am. And for those of you that don't know me, now you know that's part of my story. And when I was in elementary school, I didn't move to Oregon until middle school, and so I've been up here for, like I said, the majority of my life, but that's when it started. And I went to elementary school in Southern California, and we were partially homeschooled and partially went to public schools down there. And I used to get kicked out of class a lot for standing up for Native people and Indigenous rights. Kind of as a young child, a lot of times people think that that's your parents telling you to do these things. I can very well tell you that my mom was not telling me, or my dad, to like say stuff to my class. I just was taught things a little bit differently, and it didn't make sense to some of my teachers. And so when this day, which is federally known as Columbus Day, as a federal holiday, would roll around, I would get kicked out of class for saying that things like Columbus was a murderer to the class, and why are we learning about him? And so that's where I see something. Yeah, it's true. It is funny. I did do that. And brought up other things that he did, like his men were rapists and things like that. And people really got uncomfortable, my teachers did, because they didn't know what to do with me as this, I was little, I was in 5th grade, saying these things, and they're like, why would you say that, first of all, being that young, like, how do you know that? And I just grew up understanding what my people have gone through in order for me to be alive today, and that's really important it was really important for me to know. And so that's kind of where it started for me as far as what this day means. It meant a colonizer day, a colonizer holiday. And when I was an undergrad at OSU, I got all my degrees. I have 4 degrees from OSU. And when I was in my first undergrad degree, we used to pass out flyers in the Memorial Union and in the Quad, kind of to help people understand the history of Indigenous Peoples Day, because it actually started in the 70s through the efforts of Indigenous people going to the United Nations and asking for this day to be recognized in that manner. And so we would help educate people about that, and also talk about like information like Indigenous Peoples Day means like more than just the United States. We're talking about Mexico and Canada as well as like part of the Western Hemisphere, as part of North America. And so that we would pass that out and say, like, why are you celebrating genocide and things like that? And so that was kind of those efforts in that era of student activism on campus. And then you move into a little bit later, when I came back to work professionally on campus. I used to work at the Native Center on campus, the Kaguiksmana House, for quite some time. Actually just left that position last spring to focus on full-time professor tenure track stuff, which takes a lot of time too. And so I was with some of the staff there that were in the summer, and we were talking about how Oregon doesn't have any Indigenous Peoples Days, and we're like, well, what's up with that? And they were like, I wonder if Corvallis would do that. And so I was like, I don't know, we can ask. And so the students reached out to prior Mayor Traber and worked with his office and the King's Legacy Advisory Board over there to create the first Indigenous Peoples Day for the city of Corvallis. And Portland and Corvallis were the first 2 cities in the state of Oregon to have Indigenous Peoples Day proclamations, which is really cool because a lot of people think about small towns as not being capable of change or capable of doing awesome stuff. And I really think that they are. And y'all are a small city too. So I would say that y'all are doing some good things over here that I've heard about. But it was really important for us. It was a little bit disappointing for the students because we didn't get any news coverage. And so there was that part, and all of the focus went to Portland because they were brought in some tribal officials. I'm like, I get hot flashes too, just to let y'all know. I know we're live streaming, but if my face gets all red, that's what's going on. Just like my medication does me. It always happens when I'm being live streamed. So at our school board meetings and stuff too. But anyhow, we worked with them on that, and I thought it was pretty amazing that like a small town could create that kind of impact on the state, right? And so because other cities started doing it, and a couple of years later, the state of Oregon finally decided to proclaim Indigenous Peoples Day as well. And a lot of the language that you see in that proclamation actually draws from Corvallis's. And so I know we're in Philomath, but they're right there next door, right? Like we're right next door to each other and all. And so for this little area, our pocket of the Willamette Valley, that's part of our contribution to Indigenous Peoples Day for the state of Oregon too, which I think is pretty cool. And one of the things too is that a lot of places are like, well, why do you celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day on the other day? And it was intended to be a counter holiday, right? A counter, it's like a counter protest in a lot of ways to the federal holiday. And I remember hearing people say like, or I think it was the late John Trudell, who's one of my uncles, said like it's a day where we're asked to have like the colonizers celebrate with the colonized, and at the same time, like as people who live through colonization to have to celebrate on the same day that somebody that was a colonizer that created these enormous crimes against humanity in this part of the world, being asked to celebrate alongside him being honored. And so there's a couple of ways to view that, right? Like are you celebrating together in the long run, or are you still doing a counter kind of draw to help people understand Indigenous people survived all that? We're still here and as vibrant communities and have our ways and getting languages back and despite all the stuff. And so I think it's important to focus on that part too. And this next poem I'm going to share, I forgot to pull up my phone because I know we have I know how much time we have, so I'm a professor, I could talk all night, but I know y'all have other stuff to do. So I wrote this poem in fall of 2020, and it was modeled after Deborah Miranda, who's another Indigenous scholar. She actually is down in Eugene, but she's also Chumash and she's Esalen as well. But she wrote a poem because there was a really strong federal announcement about Columbus Day in fall of 2020. And some of the wording in it were like, whoa. And you can go back and read that probably if you're interested. And she wrote a poem out of that proclamation using a technique called deductive poetry. And so you like pull the words of something apart to make a poem out of it. And I was like, oh, I like that. I'm going to do that too. So I want to give credit to where I got the idea because it wasn't my idea. And so I called mine Proclamation of the Extremist. More than 500 ushered in a new era of the modern day United States. Today we celebrate to commemorate the beginning of a new era, immeasurable, native, inspired, for our beautiful communities of every background. Radical activists seek discussion of history, splendor, tactics, consent, view of our history. We must teach future generations our storied heritage to ensure we preserve our children and honor teaching grounded in heritage. Together, we must stop those who spread hate. On this day, we embrace optimism, the legacy of trails, a continent, wilderness, the world. In commemoration, I call upon the people with ceremonies and activities in honor of our diverse history, in witness, independence. So that was kind of my take of what the day should mean, using some words that were definitely targeted at people who do Indigenous Peoples Day, and to kind of ask us to think about the beauty we hold as humanity instead of focusing on the hate that divides us. And again, that one, for if you've ever read it or want to, it's online, but the Indigenous Peoples Day proclamations are also online for the federal ones. So that was kind of part of my response to what was going on then. And we all know that was a rough time. It's like the fall following the pandemic beginning and everything else. There was a lot of racial justice work going on in the country and in our local communities as well. And I started thinking about like how we can try to get the education out there a little bit better about Indigenous people while we were in this remote world. And so I tried to really do some programming back then at the Ina House that was focused on like live streaming. That's why I'm like, yeah, sure, if you want to live stream, that's okay, because you reach more people, right? And we were able to reach like thousands of people through Indigenous Peoples Day programming down there and through the Ina House, and brought out some great speakers that talked about like what it means to be Indigenous in this day and age. And for me, I think about myself as living in what's known as living in Indigenous diaspora. I don't live in the traditional homelands of any of my peoples, but I live in the traditional homelands of my family who are part of these lands. And so for me, it was really important to understand the context of how to live in relationship with the lands around this area. Like, what are the stories of the rivers that surround us? Like, why is the confluence of the rivers important? What are the stories of the Trail of Tears from Table Rock to Grand Ronde? What does that mean for this local history stopping by the Willamette? And I also made sure that I learned some of the local language, right? Like I took Chinookwa with my kids when they were in that program over in Grand Ronde when I worked for them. And so it's really important to me when I introduce myself, that's why you heard me say that, to try to speak some of the language of the land. I could introduce myself a little bit more in depth, but as well, but to me, just having those few words around. So I'm always asking communities like, what do you do to honor the local tribal histories? What do you do to learn about the way that colonization impacts us as a continent as well? Because a lot of times what happens is we only end up looking at these little pockets, or we only look at the United States, or we only look at the United States and Canada, and we forget about Mexico and Central America. We forget about the Pacific Islands. And so there's all these different areas that are impacted by our societies, whether it's through the choices we make with our energy, or the choices we make with who we support. And there's all these impacts across the board. And so I will go on and on about that sometimes. So, but I'm trying to look at time, Chaz. How much time did we say? We had like 20 minutes.
20 minutes, fine. We got
Okay.
plenty of time.
Because I know I wanted to make sure you all had time for questions too. So
We're at that stuff.
okay, so I'll talk a little bit more and then read this last poem to you. And for those of you that may know my work in Corvallis too, for other reasons, I serve on our school board as well. And so I'm actually the chair of our school board now. So I'm really big on education and what that means too, and how to honor like Indigenous based knowledge. And I think that goes into the work of cities as well. Like, what are you doing? How are your decisions informed by Indigenous people? Like, not just like in a governmental sense, but like the decisions that impact the local water and lands too. And so I'm going to share this poem with you called "The Tree in the Sky Are My Teachers." I'm going to drink some water first. Okay. 1. Who was your first teacher? How do I tell you it was the trees and water and sky? How do I tell you it was mothers and aunties and uncles and elders? How do I tell you for you to understand? 2. Memories. The principal called my mom. She keeps saying rocks are alive. She was taught they have a spirit too. Can you tell her to keep those thoughts to herself? Settler interruption of Indigenous teachings. Walking down cold halls, sitting in cold seats. No daydreaming out the window. Columbus was a hero. We study trees and rocks and water. They don't teach us. Settler attempts to crush Indigenous knowledge. 3. Teaching. At the bank of the Willamette, I sit with my daughter. Coolness of spring breeze and smell of fresh rain. Splash of water on rocks and soil. Listen to the water and the birds, see what they say. How do I know what they are saying, Mommy? Just listen and you will know. Listen and give thanks. Okay, Mommy. Thank you, River, for teaching me. 4. Offerings. My children and I stand at the edge of the Pacific, looking out across the channel to Limu. Tobacco clutched in palms, carried away by salt air, an offering to our homelands. Cars passing by on Highway 101. No matter where we are, who is around, we make time for this. An offering of gratitude to earth and ocean and plants, an offering to the ancestors and our lands and waters, an offering passed down from elders to my parents, to me, to my children, to the future. In moments that stand still, we understand. 5. Returning. Some teachings are ours to give, and some teachings are ours to keep, surrounded by story and braided into all we know. Some days I sit and wonder how many miss it all in the everyday hustle of capitalism. Some days I sit and wonder what I am missing. Then I remember that our stories are always there waiting, carried by clouds, curled into ferns, drawn into stars, dripping off leaves, gathering into pools of water, reflecting our teachings back to us when we are ready to return to them. And so I kind of combine my story with my experience in education with how I teach my daughter and all my kids, not just my youngest daughters. That was a specific moment with my younger daughter over at Crystal Lake Park sitting there staring at the Willamette, which is actually one of my favorite spots to go sit by the water. But just as a person, I think it's important that we make those times to listen to those messages that come down and people are like, that's not real. And I view that as a very colonial way of thinking because we can learn a lot from the world around us and what it teaches us. And we see the impacts of destructive behavior all the time. I don't know about, do any of y'all garden? I see some head nods. Did y'all's gardens make it? Mine didn't very well. It was like pretty bad. And I think that some of the plants I grow are like tobacco for ceremonial use and stuff like that. And same with marigolds, and my dogs ate my food plants, but so they didn't make it very far and they were babies, but my other plants didn't make it. And I was like, what is going on? Because like you plant them at a certain time, they start flowering at a certain time, then when it's time to harvest them at a certain time. And I was like, why did they die? And I was like, oh my gosh, the weather is a mess. We had like not clouds, we had smoke in the sky for weeks, not like off and on, like, and I was thinking about, oh yeah, that's right. That's what they theorize about the dinosaurs, right? Like the coverage of the sun. And so I was like really concerned about what that means for like the local ecology here and its impact on us as people and our ability to even grow our own foods, and how there's like a movement towards that, right? For like, how do we sustain ourselves, especially with these grocery prices right now and gas prices, and it's getting harder to do that. And so I think back to like these traditional teachings that I was raised with, and that the tribal nations here in the area, that knowledge that they hold and how important that is. And so I just thought it was really important to mention that on Indigenous Peoples Day, like there's so many teachings that we have, that some of them, like I said in that poem, some are there to share and some of them are not. And so understanding that you may not get some stuff out of tribes, there's a reason for that, or from Indigenous people, but there are things that a lot of us do want to share because we want to be able to coexist. We want to be able to live as people in general much longer than it's looking like we will. And I was telling Chaz too, when I came in, I really love that you'll have the tribal flags here to honor the sovereignty of the tribes. And so my hope is that as you all have those flags up, I know there's a relationship with the tribal nations, like governmentally, and I hope that the people that live in Philomath too, that they also understand the history of the tribes, and they take that time to understand, especially with sitting in the shadow of Mary's Peak and how important that is. And have you all seen stories about Mary's Peak from the tribes? Some of you have, some of you haven't. There's a really good one out there that talks about the floods and stuff like that and how it saved the people, that I recommend you all look at. And again, that for me, my people aren't from here, but I learned that story because I know it's important to that place. And so every time I go up there, I think about that. I think of what it might have looked like when this whole valley was full of water to those people that survived up there, and how that changed the landscape and how it continues to change. So I think I want to make sure we have time for questions, and I can offer more thoughts for you all if there's something you want to hear more about, like with my experiences or just in general. I also have other poetry if you're interested in hearing more of that. So I think that I'll call that part for right now, but yeah, so thank you.
Thank you very much.
Y'all do you have questions? Because I like talking more than anything with people, not at people.
Yeah. What is your hope for Indigenous-based knowledge in an educational setting, in elementary school or?
Yeah.
What's your vision?
Well, for Oregon, they have that amazing bill, right? Senate Bill 13, Tribal History, Shared Histories, where the 9 tribes of Oregon help develop the curriculum. And so my hope is that it gets taught like it's supposed to. And the other part is that gets centered, and that for things like Indigenous Peoples Day and other and for like the ethnic studies bill curriculum, that schools talk about other tribes too, because there's tribes here in Oregon or that have ties to Oregon that aren't federally recognized. And that curriculum focuses on the 9 tribal nations. And so I hope that that is a starting point, and that expands to talk a little bit more fully about the history of Oregon. and that understanding. And so that's kind of my hope with like the K-12s. My hope is that I'll have a class someday, because I teach Intro to Native Studies, among other classes. I teach a lot of Native Studies classes, but that one in particular, my hope. That's not my phone, it's somebody else's phone. I thought it was mine at first. Is my hope is that the students in my class, when they're writing their reflection papers, don't say they feel betrayed by their education in K-12. And so when they learn about what happened, and it's not, I don't think that it's bad for people to know. I think it's really important for people to understand our shared histories a lot better, and understand the role of treaties isn't just about Native people, it's about all people. Like, those treaties were signed so people can live here. Yeah, so thanks for that question.
Do all the tribes accept each other openly? Your stepdad is a Celeste, and you can, is there ever any pushback, or was it just?
So I can't speak for them or any other tribe, and I don't want to like overgeneralize. I will say that there's like, when somebody's adopted by some, like as a parent, that means you're part of their family. And so my aunties and uncles over there don't view me as less than their nephew, or my brother as their nephew, me as their niece. There we go. I was like, I was trying to say too many things too fast. And so they look at us as their niece and nephew, but there are things that I know aren't for me too. And that's okay. Like, I do have that understanding, and I still go to things out there, activities and cultural stuff and ceremonies, but I know where it's my place to be and not be, if that makes sense. Yeah, that's where I have a lot of tattoos for people that don't know, and I have one of the slut symbols on my arm for a reason, so yeah.
You did that amazing video with OSU Productions. You recited your poem on the coast on the salmon. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I could read it too if you want. I have to pull it up. But yeah, that one, they asked me to if I wanted, well, they asked if there was anybody that wrote poetry, first of all, and the students were like, no. And I was like, I write poetry. I don't know if you want to work with a student or if you're okay working with a staff member. And they were like, no, we just want to work with somebody. I was like, okay. And they were like, it doesn't matter. But so they asked me to write a poem about salmon mate selection, because there's this idea that salmon don't have a choice in it, and that they are just like randomly like reproduce and spawn when they get to that point in their lives. And they're finding out through research and all that, that salmon actually do know what they're doing, just like other living beings. And they choose who they're going to mate with, which I think is pretty awesome. And so they have a video on it, and it got some attention. It's on YouTube. If you're interested in it, you can just look up my name with Song of the Salmon and you'll find it. Oh, I don't know if I have it on here. I think I have it on a different drive. Sad. Now I got you all hyped to hear it, and I'm not gonna show. But
And YouTube it.
yeah, it's on YouTube. There's other Song of the Salmon, so you have to put it with my name. But basically that's what it's about. And it's really cool because it uses like some of the rivers from up here. And kind of, I do the voiceover for it, and it just talks about like how salmon, the importance of them like culturally in this area. But they did ask me to do that, and it was really a fun project. And that's like probably the biggest publication of any of my poetry. Most of my poems, there's only one that's not in a science-based venue, which is interesting too, because I don't have a science degree, but I have knowledge around that. Yeah, thanks for that question about that poem. That sounds fun. Yeah.
I have a relative and then a friend also. The relative, they are 50% indigenous. And pretty much I'd say they don't have anything to do with that culture at all, and don't seem to want to. And then I mentioned a friend, they're Latino, And recently they said I don't have anything to do with that, you know, population or something like that. What is there, I mean, I guess in both cases, it kind of bothers me. I am just a white person, but that they don't, you know, they don't care about their background, I guess you could say. Is there anything that I can share with them to help them, you know, kind of think about what they're doing that way?
To show them the light.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, that's a tough one because that's like their personal choice, right? On how they express their identity. I will say that, I can do a whole, like, like a really long conversation about the impacts of, like the intentional efforts to strip Indigenous people of our identities and, through federal laws and policies, through state laws and policies. There's a lot that went into trying to remove Indigenous people from any part of themselves. Do you all know about boarding schools? I don't know where we're at. You all know about those? You all know the horrible like saying that went with it, right? The killed Indians to save the man in him one. So that was the whole idea behind the forced assimilation. So, but it started before that. It started with like really with punishing people for being who they were, like pretty severely, and so making people afraid to express themselves. There was a thing called the Indian Code of Offenses, which outlawed our ceremonies and our ceremonial roles. And so I like to position myself, because like I'm sitting right in front of you all, as understanding like how close in time period it was before like we had freedom of religion as Indigenous people openly. And that was like, I'm the first generation born into that. So generations before, it was illegal, like literally, to practice our ways in the open. And so between that, boarding schools, there was also the Indian Removal Act that like incentivized people to move. That's why Portland was a relocation city. So there's over 300 tribes represented just in Portland, because that was one of the areas people were relocated to remove them from being able to be in their communities and that connection to land. And so I think that those are just some examples, and then we get into like some of the theft of children and why the Indian Child Welfare Act is really important, because it was like Native people just drink and do drugs and party and don't know how to parent. So we're not going to talk about why those conditions exist because of boarding schools and removal, et cetera. And that's not all Native parents, obviously. But there was this effort to say like, you don't know how to parent, so we will place Native kids in white families specifically, not any other families, but with white families, to take away that connection as well. So there's also that. And there's also historic trauma built in because of all the genocide. And I was just talking to my Native Studies class today earlier. I was like, how did I teach and do talks in the same day? I don't know. I have a lot of copy. But we're talking about like what it meant to be able to survive that level of annihilation of your people, right? There was one example that was in our book that we're reading, which is really good. It's called The Rediscovery of America, and by Ned Blackhawk. But there was one example they gave for Block Island on the East Coast, and there was 1,500 people that lived there that were Native. And 1 year later, there's 54. And so it was like, how would you be able to like, how do you like remain in like, how do you survive that mentally and spiritually, right? And emotionally. And so there's a lot of that historic trauma embedded into our communities. And for some people, it's like, it's easier to not deal with it. And for some people, they were never taught, or they were removed from their communities. And so that connection, that was the whole point of assimilation efforts like from the government, was to cut that connection. So for some people, it was hard to get back to. And for some people, they're like, I have no idea where to start, and I don't know what to do about it. And so that's, I would say probably some of that. And then when we get into the Latinx or Latinx community, I think about my own family's story, right? Like with part of my family that migrated from Mexico, that was like, you can't be indigenous, like basically people telling them that you have to choose, like you're Mexican now. And what does that mean to be able to not be able to say who you are, or to lose your language because you have to learn another colonizer language, Spanish, to learn English, right? And so that still happens to this day in that community. And so I think about those pieces too, and how that impacted communities. So that's my really long answer to say it's complicated. And so as Native identity is very complicated. And then we have, of course, the way that federal recognition comes into the picture. And so I could also do a whole class on that, specifically using places like California as an example. But yeah.
Yeah, so piece on CNN today, opinion piece by an Indigenous person expressing some dismay about land acknowledgements.
Mm.
They're varying viewpoint from this, and I know that it's changed. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to share your viewpoint.
Oh, my thoughts on land acknowledgements. Yes, I can share that. I say that's a starting point, not the end point. The starting point is if you're gonna say it, there has to be action behind it, or else it doesn't matter. Because it's like, Sherrod Yonker, he described, did you see that one, Chaz, is that what you're saying? Or you just know, you know who I'm talking about, okay, yeah. He was talking at the Calipian Land Series event, on the artist panel, and was like, or maybe, no, somebody gave the example, it was actually, somebody else gave his example of like, it's like somebody stealing your car and then they're waving at you driving down the highway, like, thanks for the car. And stuff like that. So that was one of the funner, I think, examples of the performative part of it. But I've been asked to do land acknowledgements, and if it seems performative, I'm like, well, what are you doing? I was like, I won't do them anymore unless I'm like, what is your commitment back to Indigenous people? What are you going to do? You have a responsibility if you're going to say it, otherwise it's just words. And people are like, well, I don't know what to do. I was like, well, you could start by not saying it then until you do know what you're going to do. I don't want people to not say it. I want people to know what they're getting into. And I want people to know that history. And so at OSU, when we started, actually the land acknowledgement thing happened, it has a complicated history. We'll just put it that way. When it was adopted institutionally. So since it was, we're like, okay, we need to use this momentum in a positive way now, even though the request was not to do it. But so we've been able to move a bunch of initiatives through because of it. We're like, well, you said this and you promised this. What does that mean now if you're not going to do it? And so I think there's a lot with land acknowledgements, but I view them again as a starting point to be like, what can I do next? Not like this is it, or we're only going to do it to start things at events, and then that's the only time we ever say or anything about Indigenous people is just to start events. Then that becomes a little bit problematic too. So I think it has pluses and minuses and stuff, but and especially if people didn't work with tribes on them. Yeah, so yeah. Mhm. Did you have, oh, you had your hand up too, huh, Chesapeake?
I was just wondering about Mary's River tribe. Is there a lot of information about that?
Yeah. No, that's not lost. That's all in the, both the tribes, Grand Run and Siletz have ties to this area, so they both have information. I really like referring people to that Senate Bill 13 material because it's accessible to everybody. It doesn't just have to be like for kids. And I think some people think of it, oh, that's for children and don't want to read it, but it's really good information. And I think it's great for trainings for communities to understand that history. And it's written from the perspective of what the tribes want you to know too. And so if you think about the Marys River people, you're like, okay, I know we had Chair Cheryl Kennedy talk to the Board of Trustees at a training we did from OSU a few years back. I think it was in 2019. And she actually read the names of people that were removed from here to Grand Ronde. The list was not long. It was pretty sad how short it was, honestly. But she did read the names of them. And I had never heard their names before. It was really powerful. And so I know Grand Ron has a ton of history on their webpage and Siletz does. And so just like if you want to learn more about like specifically the Mary's River or Pinafu band of Kalapuya, that's not the same band over here though, is it? Is it the same band? Okay, Mary's River, okay. Yeah, I guess it's close enough, huh? Yeah. If that's helpful. Yeah, they do have information though. There's also some really cool stuff out about William Heartless. And he was like known as the last of the Mary's River Band, even though he wasn't the last, but there were still people living actually in this area that were Kalapuya doing like service work for some of the white families that didn't get removed because they hid out as like basically as farm workers and for the farms and stuff. But there's a bunch of stuff on him online too, a bunch of his stories from the area and stuff. So yeah.
I just have a question from your perspective at OSU, but also your perspective from Corvallis School Board. When I look at the Senate bill information, it's dense in terms of its information. I mean, heavy. And it's good information. And where we find ourselves is how do we take the bite-sized pieces to be able to implement, because it's implementing across a curriculum.
Right.
Any advice, thoughts, history, opinion about how we go about digesting and making that?
Yeah, well, it has to be done, right? There's a state mandate about it.
Yeah, we're doing
Yeah.
it, but are we doing it well?
Yeah, I would say that it goes like all year, right? Do it all year and decide what unit to focus on first. And take it from there. I don't know if that's what you're already doing, but it's definitely a year long and maybe even multiple times instead of it just like we're gonna do one a month, you know what I mean? You have to spread it out, and obviously there's only so much time, but like how can that curriculum inform like the reading assignments? How can it inform like other units that people may not think it applies to? And that's kind of how I feel about the ethnic studies curriculum too, because it's out of a certain set, but it can be applied to other areas too. It doesn't only have to be like in social studies, for example. And so I would say that like see how to be creative on where it fits in to meet different standards, where it's not just like the state mandate that now we have to do. It's like, how does it meet these standards? And try it that way. Mhm. We probably have time for one more question. Okay.
I'm a believer in the power of language.
Mhm.
And what can you tell us about the sustaining and teaching of the languages? There are so many, and how is that progressing as far as maintaining the language?
Oh, yeah, so you see a rise in that, right? And one of the common things you'll see even like social media posts on, like every word that you speak is like honoring the ancestors, right? And I view it as, like I said, I learned Chinook because I felt like it was something that I should do because that was the language spoken here. And I mean, they spoke Kalapuya too, right? In this area, obviously. Chinook, if you don't know, is like a trade language, and it's like an intertribal language that's like heavily based in the Chinook language, but there's also like Old English and there's Hawaiian and there's French, and it's like a trade language for reals, like and it's a mix of languages, and that's the one that's primarily used in Grand Ronde, and that's what their language program's built upon. I was just at their history and culture summit last week, and they're doing a working with youth conversation, and they were talking about how somebody told one of the tribal youth like that it was Chinook, but it was actually Kalapuya that they were trying to say, and they were like, well, why are you using that one? And they're like, well, why is Grand Ronde using Chinook? And I'm like, wow, that's really offensive. Like, why are you telling a tribe what language to speak? Like, there are so many tribes. If you know the history of Grand Ronde and Siletz, like there's so many tribes within those tribes. And so like, it's up to them which one they want to focus on. And they focus on Dini over in Siletz. And so that's the one that they're focusing on. And so it's like finding out what those languages are and learning even little words from here and there. They're pretty accessible. Some of them are. I know Chinook is a little more accessible, but they're getting there with Dini too. But I'm always trying to figure out, okay, the state of Oregon allows Indigenous languages for meeting the second language requirement, and so do the four-year schools too. So I'm always like, why isn't that promoted more? One of the things I've been like really asking, or that when I was doing a land acknowledgement for LB for their Chinook Hall was like, you're naming this hall to honor Chinook Wawa. Are you going to teach that language? And they still haven't. And they only have a building named after the language. And I was like, you have this amazing opportunity to like learn from Lane, or how can you work with Lane even on making that a transferable, seamless like credit. So you can help bring back that language to this area if you're gonna name a hall after it. And so they were like, they haven't done it yet. I'm still working on that one, but they can also be helping local students get their language requirement done. People ask me about having a Bachelor of Science and like liberal arts degrees a lot, and I'm like, well, I could have took 2 years of learning another colonizer language because that's all that's offered, or I can just like take more science classes. So I took more science classes, and so and more math. So that's the other thing is like for Indigenous students to have access to languages, even if it's the regional language, it may not be their own tribal language, but it still exposes them. The languages is really important. And I know like ODE is working on a still biliteracy too, for like they do with other languages for Indigenous languages too. There's a lot of work on that. It's a work in progress, of course, because the language was like severely beaten out of people. And so being able to reclaim that and relearn it has been really important. I think depending on the tribe depends on where people are with that. But yeah, thanks for asking that. I really appreciate the language stuff too. Yeah.
Let's give Luhui Whitebear a round of applause. I have the privilege and honor to work with Native American tribes in my day job, and have been so fortunate to find my professional path crossing with Dr. Luhui Whitebear, so I really appreciate it. I know you probably have 20 copies of these, but we
No, I
have
don't. I love this game. If you ever
cards
played
for
it, you
decolonization. That,
stole the one from the Eating House.
oh no,
too. So it's-
but it would get the stage. This one is actually from New Mexico. And it's a little thank you card, so thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to you all. I appreciate you wanting to come hear me talk. And I hope you all have a good meeting and all too.
Oh, yeah, great, riveting stuff. You're all gonna stay, right? Thank you very much.